Today's absolutely monstrous logic of heavily militarized, heavily nuclearized imperialist states competing for what's now global and regional power. And this logic of competition is the one that gave us the First and Second World Wars, born of the competitive struggle between Britain and Germany. It gave us the Cold War, born of the struggle between the US and the Soviet Union. It's given us all the wars of the last 30 years of American superpower dominance, as Washington capitalized on its Cold War victory better to compete with newly emerging powers like China, in fact, and keep others down like Russia. And it's now, of course, given us the war in Ukraine, with Russia and the US competing for its body and soul. This driving logic of competition as the deep source of wars makes it fatuous in the extreme to see the war as simply springing from Putin's allegedly deranged or evil mind. Every modern war is the concrete expression of this general logic of competition, the war in Ukraine no less than any other. And this logic is therefore key for understanding the present war, the forces involved, and where they're taking us. Russia is, of course, the ruthless military aggressor in Ukraine, but contrary to what some would have you believe, saying so isn't at all incompatible with recognizing that far from being innocent bystanders, the US and NATO have been the driving geopolitical aggressors in this tragedy for well over 2 decades now. The hard historical fact of NATO's expansion eastwards since the end of the Cold War, the recruitment of 14 Eastern European states since 1999, can't be ignored and must surely loom very large in any rational diagnosis of the key causes of this war. Indeed, for years now, multiple commentators, many of them US geostrategists, have explicitly warned against the potentially disastrous consequences of NATO expansion, especially if Ukraine were to gain NATO membership, given its key strategic location between Russia and the Black Sea. Very simply, Ukraine is crucial for Russia. One leading US geostrategist, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was therefore surely right when he wrote that without Ukraine, Russia would cease to be a Eurasian empire. It was therefore bound to view the prospect of definitively losing Ukraine to NATO and the West as a mortal threat. Just imagine, therefore, for a minute, if the boot were on the other foot. Imagine Russia now seeking to recruit neutral Ireland, it's not in NATO, by the way, if you thought it was, to recruit neutral Ireland to its military alliance, having already recruited, say, 14 Western European states to it. You can imagine the fear and the paranoia in London and Washington would be indescribable. The US and NATO had a choice, therefore. They could have expressly recognized Ukraine's neutrality and taken NATO membership off the table, as even hard-boiled criminal imperialists like Henry Kissinger have been advising them to for years. But they chose not to. And they chose not to because they wanted to use Ukraine, in effect, to destabilize, or at the very least, to neutralize Russia as a competitive imperial power, regardless of the potentially catastrophic possibility of Russia lashing out in response, as it now has. So we've really got to ask, did it have to take a brutal Russian invasion with all the attendant loss of life for Zelensky and NATO to concede that Ukraine would be neutral, as they've now reportedly done? And if it did, as I think it clearly did, doesn't this speak volumes for the utterly ruthless willingness of the US and NATO to sacrifice the lives of others, the lives of ordinary Ukrainians, for their competitive geopolitical goals? And here, let's also be clear that if anything gives the lie to the facile assertion that the war's got nothing to do with NATO expansion, then Zelensky's reported concession on neutrality, presumably with US backing, surely does. For all these reasons, then, I think Russia's brutal military aggression is best viewed as the act of a weaker imperialist power that's now crossed the river Rubicon, made the fateful decision to halt the US and NATO, its more powerful imperialist competitors, at Ukraine's gates. As a result, what this inevitably means on the ground is that Russia's war is a war for the imperial subjugation of Ukraine and the Ukrainians. In fact, it's as much a war of imperial subjugation as the US and the UK wars were in Afghanistan and Iraq. To safeguard and to preserve its diminished post-Cold War status as an imperial power. It isn't a global power, by the way, like the US and China. It's a regional power with an economy that's in fact smaller than South Korea's. Russia is now ruthlessly stamping on and oppressing a whole nation. Although I think, clearly Ukraine's neutrality has been an indispensable war aim for Russia, I also happen to think that the signs are that on its own, it's unlikely to be sufficient. Putin isn't going to take Zelensky at his word on neutrality because he doesn't trust him and knows the US stands behind him, and he doesn't trust them. The feeling's mutual, of course. As a result, Putin isn't going to leave anything to chance now that he's invaded, and he will surely aim to ensure that neutrality is not just guaranteed for Russia, but guaranteed as much as possible on Russia's terms. It isn't, of course, easy to read what's happening on the battleground and the thick fog, amid the thick fog of war, but judging by the focus of its military campaign, Russia may well be planning to seize a whole swathe of Ukrainian territory in the south in order to cut the country off from its two seas, the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. And this helps explain why fighting has been so devastatingly intense in Mariupol on the Sea of Azov, and why the Black Sea port city of Odessa is likely to be Russia's next target. As a result, difficult though it is to tell, we might well end up with a Ukraine partitioned into a formally neutral rump with little effective room for independent maneuver, and as such, as a real potential cause of future wars. In any event, we'll have to see how events unfold. But what of the Ukrainians then? Their tragedy is, of course, the tragedy of being caught in the geopolitical vice of two imperialist powers with absolutely no compunction about sacrificing them on the altar of their competitive goals. We ourselves, obviously, we're on the side of ordinary Ukrainians, and therefore on the side of a free, fully independent Ukraine. That's why we're demanding Russia's immediate withdrawal. But it's also why we judge that the best way of preserving its freedom, its territorial integrity, and its independence is for Ukraine to be neutral. And from this neutralist perspective, it's clear that Ukrainians have been badly served by leaders like Zelensky. By turning Ukraine westwards with US support and encouragement, despite significant numbers, it needs to be said, significant numbers of Ukrainians being opposed to NATO, according to polls, Zelensky and his predecessors put the country recklessly in danger's way. Their wartime policy is merely the continuation of their pre-war one, hanging on to Washington's coattails as a counterweight against Russia. But that counterweight has failed catastrophically. Russia invaded. And now Washington's counterweight role, which is meant to be played out on the battleground with military supplies and at the negotiating table with rhetoric from Washington, is surely more feeding Russia's resolve to keep the US out and Ukraine down than lessening it. So instead of an independent popular resistance, Zelensky is leading a ruling class resistance, heavily dependent on the US. And we got a very, very stark sense of his political priorities the other day, in fact, when he chose to ban a number of apparently pro-Russian and left parties, instead of banning and disarming the Ukrainian fascists of the notorious Azov regiment. All this, therefore, makes the role of the anti-war movement an absolutely critical one. It's been the only sane voice in this madness. In Russia, as we know, thousands of protesters have been arrested, and their focus is obviously on Putin and on ensuring Russia's withdrawal, which we here must, of course, endorse and obviously echo. But clearly, we've got to go further here at home, which means focusing our attentions very much on our own government, putting as much pressure as we possibly can on our own government to ensure it does not add more fuel to the fire, but prioritizes a political settlement instead of a military one. In all this, I should add, we on the radical left have a particular, specific task to perform. We've got to bring to this discussion an understanding of the key point with which I began, and that's this, that wars are rooted in the logic of competition that's intrinsic to the very way capitalism works. This logic means war in Ukraine today. It also means war in Ukraine today will be followed as surely as night follows day by war elsewhere, perhaps over Taiwan, perhaps at the Indo-Chinese border, perhaps elsewhere altogether, who knows, but somewhere for sure. So to counter these sure and certain wars, it's clear we're going to need a standing international anti-war movement, which is at the ready to campaign and to mobilize against them in a coordinated way. But, and it's a big but, of course, if we're going to stop the drive to war once and for all, then we'll have to go much further. We'll have to go to the root of the problem, which means overturning capitalism itself. Thanks. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dragan. That's fantastic, and fantastic timekeeping as well. So thank you for that. So our next speaker is Anja Ilić. So go to Anja next.
Thank you, Elaine. Well, Dragan made some more general points about imperialism and especially about Western imperialism. I'm going to focus more on the Russian side of this imperialist coin, and to talk about the impact of both NATO and Russia in Eastern Europe, especially in the Balkans, and of course the way to break out of this sort of imperialist stronghold in this region. So of course, Dragan has already mentioned that when we look at Russia purely from an economical standpoint, we can see that it can, it can hardly be compared with these top capitalist economies in the world. It's not even in the top 10. I think it's now even below the level of South Korea in terms of its economic power. It's, I think, much closer to the likes of Brazil or Australia. But on the other hand, when you look at its military spending, it has quite a higher standing in this respect. So for example, only Saudi Arabia and Israel are above Russia in terms of its military expenditure to GDP. So this sort of influence is something which is of course derived from the Soviet Union, which is the the predecessor state of the today's Russia, and which played, I would say, a great role in terms of its continuity. The USSR was, of course, a state capitalist state. Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, went through a very severe wave of shock therapy, and then widespread privatizations and so on. And this sort of development is what produced the now infamous Russian oligarchs, who basically just took a massive amount of assets during this wave of privatizations. In terms of the nature of this regime, it is, of course, a capitalist country. It is also an imperialist country, despite the fact that it can be compared with, for example, the US or China as I would say the main capitalist, the main imperialist adversaries now in the world. But it is nevertheless a very considerable regional actor, especially because of its nuclear capabilities. Because in this respect, Russia is still unparalleled. It is even above the US when it comes to its nuclear capabilities. It's of course, a deeply undemocratic regime. I would say, however, that I don't think that Russia in this respect is some sort of an exception, because if we, remind ourselves of the stance taken by the EU in case of different referendums in its member countries, such as, the referendum in Ireland about joining the EU, the referendum in Catalonia, or most recently in Macedonia, which swiftly became a NATO member 2 years ago. You can see the same sort, basically, of this democratic deficit. But still, that doesn't change the fact that Russia, despite the fact that it has, a multi-party system, democratic elections, and so on, is I would say an increasingly authoritarian country. Vladimir Putin has been in power basically since the year of 2000, with some changes. At some point he was a president, and some other point he was a prime minister. And some 2 years ago, there have been some constitutional changes, which basically made him able to run for president again after 2024, despite being in the position of power for the past 20 years. And also these constitutional amendments made it even harder for the ordinary people of Russia. It's basically some sort of a democratic facade. So you have some very small social provisions made, but on the other hand, you have a very nationalist, even Russian exceptionalist constitution in place. And very conservative and very oppressive measures, especially aimed against those social groups and categories who are already bearing the biggest brunt of Russia's imperialism. The working class in the first place, then women, then of course many different and smaller oppressed groups. But when we talk about the capabilities of Russia to project its imperialist influence, Dragan has already said it basically represents a regional power. So its most recent wars were in part in Middle East, especially in Syria. Then it was engaged in North Africa, and now it is engaged in Ukraine. But when we talk about the Balkans, which is the topic I'm going to focus upon, there is a question if we can talk about any sort of equivalency between NATO and Russia. And even the most superficial assessment basically shows you that there can be no talk of any sort of equivalence. Basically, all Balkan states are NATO members, from Greece, which is of course the most powerful NATO member and one of its most earlier members, basically. But also Slovenia, Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, Albania, Montenegro, and Macedonia. So pretty much all of the Balkans are already in NATO, and that leaves only Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo out of NATO. However, even in the case of Serbia, which is for a good reason seen as the closest to Russia, despite the fact that it is the ruling class in Serbia is mostly speaking about its Russian ties, because Russia is a very big player in the energy sector, and it is also a very big player in its diplomatic efforts, because Russia it still has the power to veto Kosovo membership in international institutions. But even in the case of Serbia, you can talk about a very definitive Euro-Atlantic orientation, and it's been like that for years now. It's been like that in internal party struggles of the ruling Serbian Progressive Party of Aleksandar Vučić, who basically ousted the pro-Russian president Tomislav Nikolić, who ruled before him. And also, if you look, for example, at the trends of military exercises, etc., for years now, there has been a trend of many more military exercises with NATO than with Russia. But of course, these aren't really widely reported about because people in Serbia aren't really fond of NATO because of the bombing of 1999. So even this sort of analysis shows you that there can be no talk of any equivalency. And of course, NATO is justifying its continued eastward expansion by saying that all those countries who become NATO members can enjoy greater stability and prosperity, etc. And even if we look at the events which followed the war in Ukraine, we can say that this is not the case. I think the most striking example is what happened in Croatia. So it was some 10 days ago, roughly. There was a crashing of a drone near a student campus in Zagreb, which is a Croatian capital, and it was the type of drone was actually produced in the Soviet Union in the late 70s and 80s, and it has been used since 2014 by the Ukrainian armed forces. And now there are still many controversies surrounding this crushing of the drone. It is like primarily an intelligence drone, but it is now said that it was actually carrying a bomb. So presumably it was sent from Ukraine to hit some Russian aim. And of course, it has gone wrong. This drone has gone through 3 NATO member states: Romania, Hungary, and Croatia. It landed in Croatia. And basically, there was no response of NATO when this thing happened, and it fell so close to the student campus that sheer luck, played a factor for these students to remain alive in this case. Also, when you look at what is happening now in Kosovo and Bosnia, in Kosovo the government is now calling for the Kosovo to be swiftly accepted into the EU and NATO, also citing these security concerns. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, there has been a doubling of EUFOR so-called peacekeeping forces, so EUFOR troops on its ground. And all this basically speaks of enhanced militarization of those countries who become NATO members. You also have this sort of very pro-war, very hawkish rhetoric coming from the headquarters of NATO and the EU. So, after the war in Ukraine started, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was very quick to say that, now countries like Georgia, Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina may be the next, and they should be supported by NATO in their democratic efforts for democratic reforms, their free choice to join NATO, etc. And we see the same kind of rhetoric in the case of Ukraine. But what we must understand is that we can't really talk about any sort of free choice in this case. And I think that's the most striking example of that is the case of Macedonia, which became a NATO member by being virtually coerced to change the name of the country in order to become an eligible member of EU and NATO. So when we talk about these, especially those smaller states, they don't really have any sort of choice to remain neutral in any substantial sense. So in this case, of course, it begs the question of what is to be done, and Dragan has already said something about it, that war can be fought by taking a side of any imperialist power in this conflict. So you can stand with either Russia or NATO if you want this war to end. You must take a principled anti-war position. Of course, many ordinary people in Russia have been taking these positions since the Russian invasion started in late February, and you can of course see a lot of war frenzy on all sides. So, for example, only a few days ago there was a a survey. The survey results were published by a Ukrainian, well, essentially think tank, which is called Active Group. And they claim that, you know, they did like representative research for the Russian population, and that their survey showed that more than 86% of Russians support wider assaults on other EU member states, Poland in the first place, and that I think more than 75% of people support the use of nuclear weapons in this war. So when you first look at these numbers, you're kind of, you know, you get the impression that something is a bit shady about it. And then when you read further, you see that, you know, they have done a survey on, I think, around 1,600 respondents, which can in no way be representative for the Russia. I think you have to have, I don't know, at least like 4,000 households, not individuals, to make actually a representative survey in Russia. And on the other hand, they did this survey using Viber, so it is by no means representative. But this is also one example of basically adding fuel to the fire and trying to lead this war not in the direction of de-escalation, but in the direction of further escalations. And it is, of course, something which won't help many people who are now protesting in Russia and who know that they are going to face arrests and persecution and repression from their own state. There has, of course, been a very, very huge war frenzy on the part of the Russian government too. So there were some new laws passed, which basically, people are facing jail if they dare to call this war and not a special military operation, if they dare to question the role of the Russian military in this all, or to say something bad about the military, etc. There have already been more than 50,000 people arrested during the anti-war protests in Russia. So definitely the best way to support them is to build anti-war movements or to strengthen existing anti-war movements in our countries. When we talk about Britain, we talk about of course, Stop the War Coalition. But when we talk about the Balkans, here, for example, we don't have any anti-war movement, not in any particular country, nor the region as a whole. And the only way for regions such as the Balkans to make an effective anti-war stand and stand against imperialism and against their own nationalism, basically serving the aims of these imperialist powers, is to unite and to build a substantive anti-war movement, and that can only be done Balkan-wide, not in any particular country, if we wanted to make any sort of impact. And of course, despite the fact that it might seem a bit far now, it is very important to keep in mind what is this alternative strategic vision, which was first formulated by Balkan socialists in the early 20th century, of a Balkan Socialist Federation, because it remains the only key strategic alternative to get rid of both imperialism and nationalism, which reproduces it in the Balkans.